Hello and welcome to this video on monopsony. So in this video we're going to look at the term monopsony and then evaluate it. So it's important we don't confuse these two terms, monopoly and monopsony. Now monopoly is just a board game. Only joking. That's when we have one firm in the market, a monopoly. A monopsony, a different term, is when we have one buyer in the market. So what is a monopsony? A monopsony is often likened to living in a one-horse town. We just have one buyer in the market. So a monopsony exists when there is only one buyer in the market. A monopsony has buying or bargaining power in the market. And by bargaining power, we mean that they can negotiate lower prices with the supplier than they could if there was lots of firms competing. As a result, the monopsonist can reduce their cost of purchasing inputs, which increases their profit margins. Monopsony can exist in both product markets and labour markets, and what we mean by that is that you can have a monopsony firm that is the sole buyer, let's say, of a particular type of screw. That's a product market, and they're the only company that buy that type of screw. They're a monopsony. You can also have it that company is the only type of employer in that market. So they are the only employer of workers in that market, so they are a monopsony firm in the labour market. So let's have a look at some of the conditions we need potentially to have a monopsony. So when there's one buyer of something in the market. Well, often this is the case with in the government or the public sector. For example, if we think of something like nursing, the government is normally the only employer. So they have a lot of bargaining power over the wages that they can agree to pay nurses. Unemployment. So if there's high unemployment, it's likely that firms will have more monopsony power. They're more likely to have bargaining power over the many different workers that they might employ. A trade union would be another way of addressing this. And lastly, if we have a business that is a monopoly, so they're the only seller in the market, it might be likely that they must also be the monopsony, the only buyer of raw materials in that market. So monopolies are often quite likely to also be monopsonies when they're looking at the inputs that they need for their particular business. So some examples of monopsonies. So for example, electricity generator, if there's one electricity generating company, they're the only buyer of something like coal or gas in a country, then they can negotiate lower prices for coal and gas supplies from the many different coal and gas sellers. Because if they don't sell to them, who are they going to sell to? They're the only buyer in the market. Food retailers, so often large supermarkets have a lot of buying power when purchasing from small farmers. For example, wine growers, or perhaps people who are farmers who make wheat. Supermarkets can say, well, if you're not going to sell to me, there's only a few other options, so I have a lot of bargaining power. I'd like to charge you this, or I'm not going to buy from you. A car rental firm who buys cars that they then rent out, when they're going to be placing large orders, they have a lot of bargaining power with the different car manufacturers. Low-cost airlines, again, buying a new fleet of aircraft. There's only so many airlines. They have large bargaining power with the airline sellers or the aircraft manufacturers. For example, in the UK, a company called British Sugar buys almost the entire sugar beet crop produced in the UK every year. So they're the one buyer here in this particular market, and so they can drive or negotiate a hard bargain with the sugar beet farmers. Amazon is a very common example. So Amazon sell lots of products. They buy them off the manufacturers and sell them, and they're very, very large. A lot of products are bought by Amazon and then sold on to other customers through their website and their distribution channels. So Amazon are able to charge, or sorry, negotiate good prices with the suppliers because they have a lot of bargaining power, because they're so dominant in terms of buying items in the market, particularly books, as is mentioned here. We've mentioned the government previously. They're a major buyer, for example, in military procurement, or maybe prescription drugs for national health services, as we can see here. Quite a famous example is to do with milk farmers. So this picture is from a protest in a branch of Asda in the UK, and essentially what happened here is you have Asda, who are a very large supermarket, sell millions of litres of milk every year, and you've got hundreds if not thousands of small milk farmers. And so because Asda are so big, they can say to the milk farmers, right, well, if you're not going to sell us, we're a major player in the market. If you don't sell us, it's going to jeopardize, going to hurt your revenues. So we're a significant buyer, so we can negotiate hard. We want to buy your milk at X pence per litre. And this, they could drive down a very low price. And so the farmers were complaining, saying the monopsonist here, the dominant buyers in the market of our milk, are causing our prices to be so low that we can't make a fair living. Let's move on to evaluating this now. Let's look at from the firm's perspective, what are the pros and cons? Well, monopsony power allows bigger firms to achieve purchasing economies of scale. I can drive down my average costs by making very large orders, particularly if I'm the only buyer in the market. This will bring about higher profits and returns to shareholders. All the increased profit could be used to fund investment or research and development. On the flip side, if I'm a seller in the market and there is a monopsonist buyer, then they're going to squeeze lower prices out of me. This reduces the profits for suppliers in the supply chain and causes lower incomes, for example, to milk farmers, which we've just mentioned. This is a recent example, the battle of milk farmers to get a price from supermarkets that covers the average cost of their milks, so avoid losses or subnormal profits. Amazon, again, as we've mentioned, is also being criticised in the book industry. They buy so many books that they act as a monopolist, the dominant buyer, and so they push prices down, and this squeezes the profits that the book publishers can make. Ultimately, that hurts the authors, and ultimately then for the readers. Let's look at from employees' perspective. So a large-scale employer, whether they're the only buyer in the market, the only buyer of services, for example, the government, the only provider, only employer of teachers or nurses, or Walmart being a very large employer of retail staff. A large-scale employer may be able to provide some fringe benefits. So that may be a benefit to an employee where there's only one buyer of the labour in the market. The monopsonist firm, as a result of driving down wage costs and being the only buyer in the market, may be more competitive, both domestically and internationally, which protects the jobs of those workers. On the flip side, it's likely that I'm going to be more likely to have lower wages and poorer working conditions and in effect be exploited. If there's only one option I've got for employment, I can't go anywhere else. It's unlikely they're going to treat me that well or pay me that much. If I had more competition, if there's more options, then I could play them off against each other to get better conditions and better wages. Now let's look for consumers. So consumers may gain from lower prices, for example, lower prices for the final product, example milk, because the supermarkets can negotiate better prices from the manufacturers if the supermarkets are the only purchaser of milk from the farmers. Maybe I can get better value for money. So for example, if the government are the only people buying medicines, they can get good prices for those drugs, and this will drive down the cost to the taxpayer. A monopsonist can often be the counterweight to the market power of a monopolist, helping to protect the interests of consumers. So if we have one electricity company in the market, as consumers, rather than face as monopolists, what we might do is form an organisation that we're all members of that buy electricity from the electricity provider. So we create a monopsonist, a single buyer, to match the power of the monopolist. Some disadvantages. Well, the flip side of a monopsony may be monopoly. So if there's only one buyer from suppliers in the market, if there's only one buyer of milk from farmers, then it's likely there's only one seller of milk to the customer. So if we have a monopsonist, it's likely the monopsonist might be a monopolist to the consumer. Often it can also lead to restrictions in supply. There's less bought and therefore less available to sell. So in this video, we've looked at the term monopsony, and we've also looked at evaluating it from the perspective of firms, employees, and consumers. That's it. Thank you very much for listening.